As recruiting ramps up for recruits in the class of 2024, some of them will be announcing where they'll play college football over the next few weeks. One of them being Tyseer Denmark, a really talented wide receiver. The Buckeyes are in his final group of schools that he'll be choosing from. Will the Buckeyes be chosen? We'll discuss that today on Locked on Buckeyes.
You are Locked on Buckeyes, your daily podcast on the Ohio State Buckeyes. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is up, Buckeye fans? Welcome back to another episode of Locked on Buckeyes for the Locked on Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jay Stevens, also the host of the Jay Stevens Podcast. It is Friday, November 11th in the year 2022, and today's episode is brought to you by Underdog. Sign up on UnderdogFantasy.com with the promo code Locked On and get your first deposit doubled up to $100. During today's episode, we will be joined by John Garcia Jr. once again. John and I go through Tyseer Denmark's recruitment, the schools that are in his final selection, and if the Buckeyes are likely to be chosen by Tyseer Denmark on November 24th. We also discuss how likely it is that Samson, Okunloa, and Caleb Downs take a visit to Ohio State for the game against the team up north. John Garcia Jr. is the director of football recruiting at Sports Illustrated and Locked On's football recruiting insider. We try to have him on once a week to get an update on the recruiting. And John is here once again. You guys love John. I love John. And I love having John here on the show. And as we welcome in John Garcia Jr., he is the director of football recruiting at Sports Illustrated. I'd like to thank LinkedIn Jobs for being the official college football recruiting sponsor across the Locked On College Network. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. That's why LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the right people for your team faster and for free. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Terms and conditions apply. John is one of the guests that I have frequently who people love, and there's going to be a recruit we're going to talk about very quickly that people will love as well. Tyseer Denmark, 5'11", 180 pounds, according to 247 Sports. He is a wide receiver out of Philadelphia, PA, and this young man is really, really talented. His decision is coming up. He's going to announce where he's going to play college football on November 24th, which happens to be Thanksgiving, but it's also his mom's birthday, which is why he chose that day. John, what can you tell us about Tyseer Denmark, this talented wide receiver?
Talented is an understatement here. This is one of the more fun playmakers to track in this class of 2024. So just a junior, got a long way to go in his high school career, but just electric with the football in his hands. A Philly kid, you expect some confidence and some grit along with that in his game, and I do think he checks those boxes. But really, this is a slot receiver, return specialist, jet sweep, just get the ball in his hands kind of recruit. Think of a Curtis Samuel type from a body and playmaking perspective. I think Ohio State fans will certainly take something like that in the class of 2024. And naturally, when you're talking about receivers in general, Ohio State's going to be in the thick of it for the best receiver class every single year. But it's early in 2024. So we'll see if he could kind of be the foundational piece to that puzzle. But in terms of his skill set, just an electric guy with the ball in his hands. Probably has more room to go from a physical and technical standpoint. I think his footwork is elite. His quickness is elite. So the foundation to become a polished slot receiver and route runner is certainly there. But the instincts, the speed, and the twitch that he plays with the ball in his hands is something that cannot be taught. So he's one of those, again, just get the ball in his hands kind of guys. And we see Ohio State recruiting these variances in receivers in terms of their skill set and body type. So last cycle, 2 cycles ago, a lot of big, long, wide receivers. And on the current roster, you see a whole lot of that. But naturally, you want to counter that with guys who are smaller and shiftier to be a more balanced unit. So I think Tyseer would be one of those types should he pick Ohio State here in about 2 weeks.
he is one of those guys that when you watch, I was watching some clips with him very quickly before we got on here, John, and you mentioned the playmaking ability. That's the first thing that I noticed jumped off the screen. And I was going to ask, like, is he only a deep threat? Because that's one of the first things I saw was a few deep balls. He caught them easily and he scored. And then you saw him do some intermediate stuff. Saw him do some stuff from the slot with some slant routes. I even saw him do a jet sweep and even a punt return. So all the things you mentioned, it's not just stuff that's like, oh, we're talking about it. No, he's literally doing these things now. You can go on YouTube, find clips of him doing these things at a high level. That punt return thing and return thing is interesting to me because Ohio State is a school that has guys that can be elite returners. For some reason, they are not elite returners at Ohio State. So maybe he comes in, the Philadelphia, the grittiness, maybe some swag he brings to it being a receiver, and he pushes the guys at Ohio State to be better returners because he is electric. And that's one word that popped into my mind when I saw him play in the clips I watched of him on the football field.
There's no doubt about it. Again, the lateral ability, the quickness, the ability to make folks miss in space is really his strength as a football player. So if you can bring on polish and some size along with it, all of a sudden you're looking at a truly dynamic slot type. But look, this is something that, again, Ohio State, I think Igbuka occupies a lot of that right now. But really, all these receivers we see trotting out for OSU are bigger, longer, more conventional in their style. So it makes sense that they're coveting a little bit more variance in that body type and skill set type here going forward. Again, reminds me a little bit of Curtis Samuel, another Northeast kid out of Brooklyn, coming out of high school, that he played all these positions and did all these things to the point where I think Alabama, a couple of schools were recruiting him as a corner. Ohio State was like, no, we want to put the ball in your hands and let you go to work. And he liked that, having played running back and receiver in high school. This kid reminds me a little bit of that. And just in terms of, he can probably do anything you need at receiver, returner, cornerback, slot, etc. But really, I think his ceiling is right there in the slot with the ball in his hands. Just too much playmaking to throw on the defensive side of the ball here. And I think, again, when it comes down to his recruitment, you got to feel good about Ohio State's chances, not only because, look, he's a receiver and they want him, and it's sometimes that simple for Ohio State. But I think coveting him and pushing this early is a big deal for the Bucks. Heavy competition here. He hasn't really narrowed his list beyond that top 12 from the summer, but Philly kid, so Penn State is going to be in the mix here. They've done really well with slot receivers over the years. If you think of Dotson recently, Parker Washington right now, that's something that has impressed him. So I think in-state wise, that's going to be some premier competition for the Buckeyes. But again, it's just really tough to project a top receiver target picking another program at this time. But if there was a school to watch, I would say Penn State could be interesting. He was there for the whiteout just a couple weeks ago.
I also saw Tennessee might be in there. I didn't see his top 12 list, but Tennessee might be in there. And I know they have a talented quarterback. I can't remember if the kid is in the volleyball player that also plays quarterback. I forget if he's 2023 or 2024. But that might be really enticing when you have a guy that elite going to Tennessee, especially with what they're doing this year alone with that offense. That might be an appeal for this young man to say, wait, I can't just go to the certain schools. Tennessee's doing amazing things, and volunteer fans are crazy and wild and would love to have this man be a volunteer.
100%. You know, they've already gotten going in their class of 24 with an elite receiver. They just got Mazio Bennett a couple weeks ago, another slot type, explosive returner type. So, look, Tennessee's going to benefit at wide receiver and offensively overall over the next couple cycles. And yeah, they're in it for Tyseer here, Denmark. But I just don't think, with him being a Philly kid, it's not the same type of pull as if he was from Atlanta or in the Carolinas, where they've had a ton of success at the receiver position. So I do think Tennessee, a couple other schools are going to make it interesting, but it really kind of has the feel of do I stay home and play for Penn State kind of deal, or do I go where all the elite receivers go and play at Ohio State? And I think with his commitment coming up here soon and the lack of experience, maybe visiting some other places outside the region, I think it'd be hard for some of those schools to close the gap in a short amount of time.
John, every offseason, Brian Hartline is a wanted man. People are trying to poach him out of Columbus to go to other schools and maybe be an offensive coordinator at another school, high-level Power 5, or maybe be a head coach at a G5 or a lower level Power 5. Brian Hartline's a wanted man. And I bring him up specifically because I think this offseason is going to be very, very a lot different, where you might get more, hey, this school targeted or focused or narrowed down, like all the words, the insiders that follow that have all the sources. They say, oh, well, that's our target. Well, a lot of times by the word they use, you can tell if they're going to go and snag him from said school, his current school, or not. In Ohio State is very interesting because the guys that are in the class 2023, a guy in Tyseer that you're trying to get in 2024. If Brian Hartline leaves, and I'm not saying he's going to be gone, but if he does leave, that might lead a man like Tyseer to decommit and then reopen his commitment, his recruitment. Not saying he's going to not go to Ohio State altogether, but if Brian Hartline leaves, that is a big impact on a young man like Tyseer, who is not going to be going to college in the next year. He has another year of high school ball to play. So that's a factor I do believe in Tyseer that maybe might sway him either pre-decision or even post-decision once that is announced.
Oh, 100%. I mean, if Hartline leaves, that's a big deal for the school getting him and for Ohio State altogether, right? I think he's been as important a positional coach and recruiter as there has been in the country. So I think that's a big deal if and when something like that happens. Ditto for Larry Johnson. You go to other schools and you just know the guys, right? Corey Raymond with defensive backs across the country. Tashard Choice at running back, I think he's kind of an emerging star there. Those guys are tied to those positions. So when they move on, it certainly creates a considerable ripple effect. But I do still think on one end, Ohio State's going to be able to continuously recruit elite receivers because that track record is attached to them, just like it is attached to Hartline. And then two, going to be tough to pull Hartline out. I mean, he's an Ohio guy, played there, played the position. He seems comfortable. Things are working and rolling so darn well. It's hard to leave that consistency and comfort, again, especially when your allegiance to that school is something that's been a part of your entire life. It just hits different. It's like Jim Leonard at Wisconsin. It hits different when it's your school. Cadillac Williams at Auburn as an interim coach, been amazing to watch over the last week or so. So it just feels different in those regards. So I do think that it'll be hard to pull Hartline away, but from a business standpoint and from a career path standpoint, there's not a whole lot more he can do at Ohio State. So naturally, if he does want to build that resume and maybe one day return to Columbus, he's going to have to take that step outside the box. But we've seen assistant coaches with ties to their schools for a long time be really, really hard to poach. And not everybody has those aspirations to be a play caller or to be a head coach. I mean, those are different animals, especially in this era of college football and roster management, NIL, the portal. It's just a lot more headaches where you're looking at coaching compared to even 10 years ago, where now guys don't necessarily want to take that leap. Although, again, financially and in other spaces, there is motivation to do so.
John, the announcement, as I mentioned earlier, from this young man, Tyseer Denmark, is going to be on November 24th. It's his mom's birthday. He's making this about helping. I know mom's been a big part of it. That's about her. What do you think he's leaning? Penn State, Ohio State, another school? Where do you think he's leaning right now?
I think it's Ohio State. Again, the timing, just the need there. We talk about this foundation of the 2024 class at Ohio State with Raiola on board. You talk about an elite quarterback coming into Tennessee. Raiola on board at Ohio State in the same class, I think is going to have some cachet, right? We talk about Nico Iamaleava at Tennessee, Arch Manning at Texas that have kind of galvanized. I think Dylan Raiola is going to galvanize in that class of 2024. And when you see his skill set, the ability to play off script and put the ball anywhere on the field, that's going to bring even more receiver eyeballs towards what Ohio State is building. And again, advantageous from a timing perspective. If you want to get on this boat, this Ohio State receiver boat in the 24 class, theoretically sooner rather than later, because the 23 class is big, right? 4 wide receivers, a big group. You don't typically bring in 4, and then bring in another 4. I haven't looked back at Ohio State's last few classes, but it's atypical to bring in 8 receivers in 2 cycles. So in theory, you're going to have probably a 2 to 3 man receiver group. So naturally, the spots will be somewhat limited at that position where Ohio State is going to recruit nationally anyway. So I think the timing and all that lines up pretty well for Ohio State. Again, Penn State's the in-state school. To me, the top threat, especially with their production at the slot in particular. I think they've done that very well under James Franklin over the years. But I do think ultimately this is Ohio State's race to lose.
I think one of the first recruits John and I talked about when John became a staple for us college hosts, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, was Samson Okunloa. Big, massive human being, 6'5", 300 pounds. I think you called him your prototypical offensive tackle, left tackle at the time back then. But it's been some time, like I mentioned. Could you kind of refresh everybody on who this recruit is and why he's sought after by all the big dogs in college football?
Well, not only is he the top uncommitted offensive tackle in the country, Jay, he's the number 1 offensive tackle, period, for us at Sports Illustrated. Just a prototype at the position, as you mentioned. 6'5", 6'6", 300 pounds, but carries it well. Like, he is well built at 300 pounds. It's not sloppy. He looks like he's getting ready for the NFL draft as opposed to transitioning from high school to college football. Just an elite movement, an athlete player at the position, built to combat these modern era pass rushers that are a little bit smaller, a little bit faster than those of yesteryear, but he's still got the grit and forward and leverage ability to emphasize the run game on top of it. So he checks just about every box there is from an offensive tackle standpoint. So naturally, him still being uncommitted has created a whole lot of movement in his recruitment, right? He took 3 officials in the offseason, Miami, Alabama, Michigan State. So now he has 2 officials left during the season, and Ohio State is one of those jockeying for position to potentially land one of those official visits. Ohio State, Georgia, Florida, Oregon, among those that are trying to get him in for one of those final 2 official visits. Unofficially, he's spotted recently down at Miami for the Florida State debacle that just happened on Saturday. And then previously, he caught a game at Boston College, which is the in-state school. We don't expect him to end up there, but, that is the hometown school, easier to get to for Okunloa. So now the question becomes, it's really twofold. Where are those 2 officials going, right? Because he wanted to do them in September. It didn't happen. His team plays on Saturdays. Hard to schedule those. But now that his high school season is winding down, he's got some availability to take some officials. Who gets those final 2 trips? If I had to guess, I would think Ohio State gets one, and the second one is up for grabs. I think Oregon, Penn State, Florida are all in the running thereafter. Georgia could be a sneaky program in the race as well. And then the second question, Jay, when is he going to pop? There is a likelihood and an expectation almost to where he decides in December. We heard rumors at various points this year that he was ready to either narrow his list and or make a verbal commitment, especially after those officials back in the summer months. So naturally, you push that towards a December decision in terms of signing on the dotted line. But it's gone pretty slow, and those officials still aren't set. So theoretically, he could take his time, maybe take the trips in December and January, which would push him to sign in February, which wouldn't be the worst news for Ohio State. I think Miami has garnered a lot of momentum. We talked about he took that official in the summer and was back on campus this past weekend. And again, yes, Miami got blown out by Florida State and looked awful at every single position, but it's never that simple in terms of how it translates into recruiting. I mean, Miami's got a borderline top 5 class, even though they've lost 1,000 games this year, right? So it's never that simple in terms of correlating on-field products to recruiting, especially for a first-year coaching staff under Mario Cristobal. So Miami's probably the favorite at this point. So the longer it takes him to actually make things official, the better for all the other schools trying to make up some ground here, including the Buckeyes.
Another one. We talked about spots for Okunloa and him, but Caleb Downs is another one that people have been eyeing. Yes, he's an Alabama commit, those of you that follow recruiting very closely. But there's an idea, maybe possibility, that the Thanksgiving weekend games, rivalry weekend, he takes an official to Ohio State. John, I don't think we talked about Caleb Downs at all when you and I have been together doing the recruiting stuff. Try to do it weekly. 6 foot, 185 pounds, 190 pounds. He's a safety. Numerous places. SI is probably the same way. The number one safety in the country in the class of 2023. He's talented and similar to Tyseer Denmark. When I watched some tape on him and just different clips, I was very surprised, but also pleased and shocked with how well he was at reading run and in getting tackles for loss in the backfield. At the high school level, with what I saw, the quickness of reading the play and then being able to get there very quickly, it's unheard of. And that's just one thing I saw of many great things. What do you see with Caleb Downs?
Just a football player, an elite, high floor, high ceiling football player that could be the safest bet in the entire country. I think Brandon Ennis is in that conversation. I think Ennis has the highest floor of any recruit in the country. I've been on record for that for over a year. I think he is an absolute star and will be the moment he gets to college. But I think the safest bet overall could be Caleb Downs. I just think he is too good at playing this sport of football, even on offense. I mean, you watch him in high school, he plays quarterback, running back, receiver. They just need to get him the football on offense, but defensively, the instincts, the ability to find the football, it's something that you can't quite coach. You either have it or you don't. It reminds me a little bit of Buda Baker in the NFL, a guy who you line up at slot, you line up at safety, you line him up as a rover, almost as a linebacker, and he's making plays at every single position. Not going to wow you from a height, weight, speed standpoint, but everything is good enough to make plays at the next level. Buda Baker, maybe even the Honey Badger type of player, to where he just does a little bit of everything and impacts every single down from a defensive standpoint. And then he's got the intellect to probably captain that defense one day in Tuscaloosa or Columbus or Athens, wherever he ends up. So just an elite football player all the way around. And I think that's why his recruitment isn't quite done, right? He took a bunch of officials in the offseason, including Ohio State, before he committed to Alabama. And there was really not a lot of conversation after that point. But then last week he showed up at Georgia for that Tennessee showdown. That's the in-state school for him. So now there is some traction and obviously a willingness to take additional visits. So the question becomes, as you mentioned, what is he going to do rivalry weekend? It's Thanksgiving weekend as well. Ohio State's got a home game. Bama's got a home game, of course, against Auburn for the Iron Bowl. And, of course, the game, Ohio State-Michigan in Columbus on the same day. So it could be quite simple here. If he shows up in Tuscaloosa, probably going to end up at Alabama, because a lot of people feel like Ohio State is the top threat to Alabama. And if that is going to be reciprocated, he needs to get back to Columbus at least one more time before all is said and done. Others feel like Georgia's the top threat, and he's already made a trip to Athens. But I do think from the Alabama perspective, there's a little bit more worry from Ohio State's potential setting for him as opposed to Georgia's. So it could be that simple. Does he get to the game or does he go to the Iron Bowl? If he gets up to the game, it's game on in that Caleb Downs recruitment, and it will come down to the home stretch because he is one expected to sign in December. So theoretically, that would be his last visit. And then 2 weeks later, he's signing a national letter of intent to one of these schools with a different shade of red. So it will be fascinating to see down the stretch. He is absolutely worth even a puncher's chance if you've got it from the Ohio State or Georgia or Notre Dame or whoever else angle. Go get Caleb Downs. He is that good. He's a guy who will not sit, for very long once he gets to college.
Where do you think he ends up? Your prediction, at least that rivalry weekend, is it Iron Bowl, the game? I know we're just like kind of predicting stuff, but where do you think he at least takes that official visit or takes a visit that weekend?
Well, I do think the Georgia visit was interesting in terms of the timing, right? Because if Bama, let's say Bama's more worried about Ohio State in this race. If they were more worried about Ohio State and then Caleb shows up at Georgia, you're like, hold on now. Now you're doubling down. Now you're like, hold on, I really need to get him on campus for the Iron Bowl. I think you wanted him on campus anyway. He's a Georgia kid, not very far to Tuscaloosa. But I think that Georgia trip is probably a galvanizing point from the Alabama perspective, especially with a couple of losses this year. In recruiting, they're going to double down on a lot of these recruits. So I think that is going to help reemphasize Caleb visiting Tuscaloosa over Columbus come rivalry weekend. But look, the kid's an independent thinker, a mature kid, very calculated, very smart when you talk to him and how he makes these decisions. If there is still due diligence to be made with OSU, and again, some people feel like that's the top threat to Bama, I do think he takes the trip to Columbus, independent of the push from that Alabama perspective, because he could always swing over to Tuscaloosa, just a couple hours away from his Atlanta area home. So will be interesting to see down the stretch, but it's that simple. Wherever he shows up, you feel pretty good about going into National Signing Day. But again, Caleb Downs is absolutely worth it, even if it's just a puncher's chance.
Last thing for you, John, here very quickly, kind of combining Okunloa and Caleb Downs together. If we're picking and saying Ohio State has the best chance to get Okunloa or they have a better chance to get Caleb Downs, who do you think the Buckeyes have the best chance to get between those two guys?
Well, one's committed and one isn't. So I'm going to go
Correct.
with the uncommitted guy. I go with Okunloa. I think he's been comfortable with Miami for a long time, but he's still not committed, right? And there's potentially a reason for that. There's something potentially out there for Okunloa still to grasp. And Ohio State is one of those schools that just hasn't been able to get him on campus. So if and when something like that happens, I feel like Ohio State can potentially trend for him in a hurry. And obviously, they, geographically, that's the closest school to that area compared to the other schools on the list, right? Miami, Alabama, Oregon, Michigan State. So naturally, I do feel like Ohio State's got a little bit better credence the longer that Okunloa recruitment goes on. But he's got to get to Columbus first, there's no doubt. And I think if you're going to flip Caleb Downs, he's got to get to Columbus as well. So definitely, like the whole world we'll have a lot of eyeballs on that visitor list come rivalry weekend.
Yes, we will. John, it's great having you back. Thanksgiving season, holiday season is here. Got a commitment coming up very, very soon in a couple of weeks. Got a couple talented guys that are Ohio State's going after like normal. Not sure what's going to happen between now and the next time we talk, John, but my guess is there might be a commitment or some crazy wild news that comes out about Ohio State recruiting. John, thanks for coming back on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Always a pleasure, Jay. Thanks for having me.